Continually, Nurse Chapel proves herself to be my favorite weirdo dork on the Enterprise, and I am here for it. Hello interwebs and welcome, because it is time to review yet another episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, this time episode 4, Memento Mori. As per usual, spoiler-free overview thoughts up front and then spoilers in the back, but spoiler-free again. This show is just continuing to knock it out of the park. This episode is a much more action-packed episode, sort of evoking, in some ways to me, like Wrath of Khan, or probably more directly, Balance of Terror. And there's another episode, too, that this one is very clearly pulling from in Star Trek, the original series, that I don't necessarily want to say outright, because it is a little bit of a spoiler for the first 10 minutes or so of the episode, given that the first 10 minutes of this episode really builds up towards the reveal of this. But stylistically, it's much more drawing upon, like, Balance of Terror, while also pulling from other episodes of Trek lore as well. And it is just phenomenal. The way that this episode builds tension around our crew being under attack and in a stressful situation, not only is just incredibly well handled, but it also, like, uses the area of space around them to tell a really cool space battle. Because I feel like, and this is a problem with a lot of science fiction, but we see it within the franchise of Star Trek, especially in Voyager had this problem, Enterprise, and even Discovery has had this issue as well, is that when we see big action space battles, they don't really take a lot of usage of space of itself, like actually some of the science and things that you could encounter in space, like black holes, giant red dwarfs and stuff, and it ends up just becoming a giant shooty battle with like big ships just shooting guns at each other. And so I like that this episode really utilized actual science, things like redshift and black holes and red dwarfs and stuff like that, in order to build the tension. And I think the last time that I really saw that, even Next Generation had this to a degree, Deep Space Nine a little less so, but I think the last time I really remember this in the franchise being the case was Wrath of Khan. I think did a great job with that. And I just really enjoyed seeing the usage of that here. But then on top of that, I also really loved that we got to see Pike being a really wonderful commander throughout all of this. You feel the weight of every choice that he has to make in these battle decisions through Anson Mount's performance. Like, there are just some moments where, like, he loses crew members in this episode, and we get a lot of red shirts in this episode for the first time in the season so far, that he just, like, lets the weight of it hit him. And unlike other Star Trek shows where red shirts just die and we don't really care, you feel that these deaths really affect him and hurt him. And yet he doesn't let it overrun his need to be captain in the moment. Like, he'll let it hit him for a moment, but then he moves on and he keeps dealing with the situation. And so just those like small moments of captaincy we saw throughout Anson Mount's performance in this episode were fan-freaking-tastic. But that all being said, this is very much La'an Noonien Singh's episode. She gets the central focus here. She gets to be the one sort of dealing with her past trauma that we saw mentioned in episode 1 of the series, but now it really coming to the fore and informing a lot of her decisions here. And I really enjoyed that this show doesn't necessarily stop to give us backstory about her, but allows that backstory to be evoked by the current situation going on and have it come up in how she's acting. And there are a few moments too where we get to literally see her backstory, but I think they often come out of the situation present at hand, and not just sometimes what Discovery did, which was stop the action cold to have characters exposit backstory at us. And so I like that it was all pertinent to the story being told here, and just wonderfully, wonderfully done. And then on top of that, we do get 2 little side stories here. One with Una dealing with being a medical patient. That one I'm a little less positive on. It's not bad. It's just sort of like, okay, yeah, this is a fine episode with Una being in sickbay. Cool. And then we also get another fairly standard storyline, but one that works better for me, in Uhura and Hemmer having to work together to deal with another situation going on the ship. And while the storyline wasn't particularly new, we've seen storylines like it before, like in episodes of Next Generation. There was the episode where like Geordi and Crusher were stuck together in like a cargo bay, so very similar stuff to that. But it does use the standard situation to give us a little more depthful look at Hemmer as a character and Uhura as a character. So while it's not breaking the mold in any way, shape, or form, it does allow us to explore these characters a little bit more, and I really enjoyed seeing that. And so we have yet another great episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Like, continually, this episode is just hitting a high bar. I don't grade the episodes because I don't really believe in numerical numbers, but this has been hitting, like, great levels for me every single episode, which I'm honestly kind of shocked by. Like, no show really ever hits that amount for me. It's gotta have a dud somewhere in here, I'm sure. But these have been all phenomenal, and this one just continues that trend. But with all that being said, that is my spoiler-free section. So if you have not seen the episode, we are going to get into spoilers. So be warned, because there is a spoiler for the first 10 minutes of the episode. All right, everybody, now that we're in spoilers, Gorn! Oh, this was so cool. It was so awesome to see the Gorn come back up in this episode and not only fit within the canon that we've seen of them so far, given the fact that we learned in Star Trek the original series that no one had ever seen a Gorn until Kirk fought the rubber suit Gorn on Arena in that episode, but also fitting in the ways the Gorn work in that episode, because we get the crew going down to this planet that they were supposed to visit and seeing the havoc that has been wreaked across the colony, similar to what we saw in the opening of the episode Arena in the original series. And the darkness and really horrifying nature of how it's displayed really evokes why La'an, as we sort of discuss more throughout the episode, would have this PTSD of how horrible the Gorn really are, like dragging bodies into places like really dark and really gross to see. And I like that it takes a little bit of time for us to get the reveal that they are the Gorn. Like, we get to meet the colonists, we get to see that they make Enterprise vulnerable by connecting their ship there, and the Enterprise can't put up shields, and just like the slowly building tension throughout the first 10 minutes of the episode, right up to when we get La'an sort of like hearing the clicking from the kid, and she being like, oh crap, Gorn, and we can't put up our shields. Crap. Like, the tension building there was just really, really good. And while it wasn't particularly a shock to me when it was revealed to be the Gorn, like, I figured since we saw, like, La'an being the center focus at the beginning of the episode, I'm like, it's probably going to be a Gorn episode once we sort of saw what was going on. I like that they really build to that reveal, and it just works so well. The other thing, too, is I do like symbolically the opening of the episode where we get the crew putting on the badges for Starfleet Remembrance Day, remembering the people that they lost. Number one, I like that evoking, like, Starfleet history and, like, rituals that Starfleet crew members do, something that would make sense for them to do. Like, we didn't really get to see a ton of that in other Star Trek shows, so good to see that those little small things. But also, I like La'an being like, I don't put on the badge, I don't look back, I just look forward. And her having to come to terms with needing to look back throughout this episode also worked really well. Like, just a nice symbolic way to showcase what the character needed to learn as the character arc throughout this episode. So great there. And so we get into the episode with the crew having to deal with the Gorn attack. And I'll sort of split off our different storytelling focuses here. I'll start first with the Una in sickbay with Mbenga and Nurse Chapel scenes, because those are the ones that I have the least to say about. Una gets hurt, and she's sort of like, I can handle it, I'm better, but then she falls and collapses in sickbay. It sort of fits her character, like, I'm strong and I can handle it. And constantly, like, being willing to give plasma to people and things like that. And I like, again, seeing Mbenga and Nurse Chapel's competency throughout the entire episode. Again, Nurse Chapel being like, I'm a weirdo dork, I am just here for it. Like Una saying, who says that? And Chapel's like, me, at her weird turns of phrase was just great. But overall, it was just like a good sequence of them being competent and also showcasing how far medical technology has advanced in Starfleet, that like surgery, like using surgery and sutures is like kind of hard and not really thought about as much in the Federation at this point. So that was like a nice little nod to that. But also, again, just showcases everyone's competency in dealing with a crisis situation at hand, and Mbenga having to sort of deal with triage in all of that. Not badly done, but not particularly like the most to talk about there, but all well handled and showcase the characters really well. But then this brings me to the second storyline, where we get Uhura and Hemmer having to deal with being locked up in the cargo bay, dealing with the sort of technology piece that they were going to deliver to the colony possibly going off. All of this was great to me. I mean, number one, I liked seeing that Uhura, because she's a cadet, is in rotation, going to different places like engineering, but still being competent even in things that aren't her direct sort of purview, like being a linguist, because we even see in the original series, like, Uhura knows how to mess around with the consoles. She is a good engineer to a degree, and so I like seeing that, like, being evoked here as a cadet. But then I also really enjoyed seeing her and Hemmer's conversations. Again, this wasn't a particularly new situation. We've seen, like, crisis situation, having to stop a bomb going off while also talking to each other's situation. But we did get to learn a little bit about stuff. Like, Hemmer really likes to work with his hands. He really likes to be in there. It's hard for him to trust other people. And coming to terms with trusting Uhura was, like, a hard thing for him to do, but not necessarily one that was, like, a huge deal. But he was able to do it. But it was something that made him uncomfortable. And so I like seeing that, like, not, like, hating on the character, but, like, subtle criticisms of his characterization. And then we also get Uhura learning subtly, like, having to put her hand on the thing and touching things and, like, learning things to touch rather than, what she's used to doing. All that was great to see. But then getting into, like, the heart of the characters, where we learn that Hemmer joined Starfleet not because because he wants to believe in Starfleet's values. That he originally was going to be a botanist, but he believes Starfleet values the most. And fitting in with Star Trek Enterprise, what we learned that many Enar are pacifists, he is a pacifist as well, but that does not mean that he is passive. And I like that understanding of pacifism, because so often in discussions of pacifism, people say, like, oh, they just will let themselves get punched on the face. They won't do anything. It's just like, no, pacifists can still be active and do things. They just won't necessarily engage in direct violence. But they are not passive. They still will, like, uphold these ideals. So I really like seeing that. And I also like seeing his belief that people only die once they fulfilled their mission, like, to do things. And so Uhura being kind of evoking Uhura, not really knowing what she wants to do yet as a cadet, kind of going back to episode 2. And just referring a little bit more to Uhura's arc, but also building out Hemmer. All of that was great. And at the end of the episode where they almost have to die in order to create the decoy in space, because I love the moment when Pike calls them, and he's worrying if they're dead. Well, we knew they weren't going to die. We all know Uhura's not going to die. And we doubt Hemmer's going to die too, because he's such a new and interesting character. And so it was like a little bit of false tension, but made it work for me was Anson Mount's performance of him being like so relieved when he finally heard their voices. All that was great. But then this brings us to the real meat of the story, which is La'an, Noonien, and Singh, and dealing with this attack from the Gorn. Every step of the Gorn attack I really, really loved, and how the crew dealt with it, because La'an sort of saying, like, we need to get an equal footing. They were waiting for us to be vulnerable. They were trying to get us down. So Pike listening to her and putting them into the, I think it was the Red Dwarf or Gas Giant or whatever it was, but near the black hole to be able to escape them, and all the tactics that they use, like Pike being smart and like dropping the photon torpedo on top of them, but then the Gorn realizing using that at sacrificing their own people in order to get a sight on where the Enterprise was a great escalating tension and showcased the ruthlessness of the Gorn. Spock also being able to use like the navigational systems in order to create a navigational system for them within this. I thought that was also really cool. The ability at the end of the episode to use redshift to create a decoy using the explosion from Uhura and Hemmer's thing that they were working on to hide the fact that the Enterprise survived. That was actual science being used to deal with this situation and the unique circumstances of where they were in to these circumstances. I like that we were using the situation in space to be able to deal with the situation, not just like, let's just shoot at each other more. I thought that was also excellent. The fact that La'an later on, as we sort of get her backstory, is able to twist the Gorn's signaling communication, their Morse code, against each other, and the Gorn being ruthless and murdering their own people. Again, showcasing the ruthlessness of the Gorn was fantastic. I just really loved all of that. But then this getting reflected all the way to within La'an as well. I loved the scene where they're in the ready room sort of like trying to figure out what to do with the situation, and La'an's just like, you know, this is the way. They're ruthless. They don't empathize with the enemy. They only see us as prey. And Pike calling her out privately for that, and I like that he did it privately, not in front of everybody, being like, look, I get that you're trying to distance yourself and just taking it matter of fact, but also checking in on her because he knows that she has some sort of trauma from the situation. And I think he was sort of recognizing that, but also looking at the fact that, like, if you're going to be a good commander, you can't just be matter of fact all the time. You need to inspire. You need to encourage them with something more than just statements. And La'an sort of saying, I'll make that adjustment. And while I don't think we necessarily see her doing that within the episode, we see Pike doing that later on with his inspirational speech to the crew towards the end. I like that La'an's learning that, and we'll sort of see that in her character arc, I'm sure, going forward, of her learning this lesson of being able to be inspiring and not just being this cold, calculating person through this situation, and having to come to terms with her own trauma, because when Spock and her got in the shuttle, which was also cool to see, them being willing to sacrifice themselves to try and learn more about the Gorn, we do get the mind meld situation. I thought the mind meld was a little bit contrived to, like, get Spock to mind meldy sort of stuff. But, you know, because I feel like you could have done it with just her sort of, like, remembering PTSD moments instead of mind melding. But I don't hate it. It's not the worst thing in the world. But we get to see the death of her brother and how she feels, you know, trauma at that. But that's how she remembers the sort of blinky, like, Morse code stuff that the Gorn use. Was also cool to see. But then I also like the nice little reference to Star Trek Discovery here, where La'an learns a little bit about Michael Burnham, because we get the little hint of Michael Burnham in those moments. So nice little, I love that Discovery is not like the center focus. It's not like overriding the character arcs or anything like that. This show is its own show. It's not being overridden by Discovery. But that Discovery still has pertinence when it comes up naturally within these characters. And Spock being able to connect with La'an on that level over her brother's death was also really cool to see, using what we know from Discovery. So awesome to see that moment. And so that sort of wraps out most of this for me, because when we end the episode with them getting away, again, I like Pike sort of having that moment of relief at seeing some of his crew members surviving, but then also feeling the weight of the death of the crew members that did die. Also, Lieutenant Kyle just getting saved by the other crew member pushing him forward. Also pretty dark. I hope we get to see that come up for Lieutenant Kyle later on, like he has some survivor's guilt maybe. That was too dark of a scene for it not to come back up at some point. Probably not to be dealt with here, but I do hope we get to see that recur for Lieutenant Kyle and him getting a little bit of trauma from that moment. We'll see if that does come up, because it was very dark for it not to be relevant later on. But La'an at the end sort of learning from Pike that she needs to be more inspirational, and we'll see that hopefully going forward with the character, but really the core that she needed to learn of this episode was not that, but it was that she can't necessarily turn away from her past, but that she should look at it and sort of see what she can learn from it, but not necessarily judge herself for it. I think honestly, this look at trauma here was done better in this episode than I think the entirety of Star Trek Picard did sometimes in season 2. So that was all really just, I think, wonderfully done throughout all of this. Also, the SS Puget Sound. It's someone who lives in Seattle right now. Nice to see that. So overall, another fantastic episode. This episode is like how space action, character drama should be done and should be interwoven together. Just fantastic overall, and continues to prove to me that Strange New Worlds might be the best live-action Star Trek show on right now. I am really just adoring this series front to back. But that's everything that I had to say. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Did you like this episode? Hate this episode? I'd love to hear all of that. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more reviews of Star Trek Strange New Worlds and other things that I'm doing here on this channel, as well as my main channel, Jessie, where I do my more video essay type stuff. I do have my Sex and Star Trek Part 2 coming out very, very soon, so be ready for that. I'm very pumped for it. And I also have the podcast Jump Kate, which I do with my friend Vera Wild of the Council of Geeks channel, where we rewatch Babylon 5, her for the first time, me for a second time, which is a lot of fun. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.